Before he burst onto the webcomic scene with the now famous XKCD, Randall Munroe worked as a contract programmer and roboticist for NASA. In addition to being a cartoonist, he is an author, engineer, and scientific theorist. Quite the resume for someone under 40 years of age. His first book, What If? Serious Scientific Answers to Absurd Hypothetical Questions, was published in 2014 to rave reviews, I might add, in which Munroe answered hypothetical science questions sent to him by his readers. The impetus for the book was Munroe's wonderment as a child at the question, are there more hard things in the world or soft things? He ultimately concluded that the, quote, world contained about 3 billion soft things and 5 billion hard things. You learn something new every day. Then came his 2015 book, Thing Explainer, Complicated Stuff in Simple Words, in which Munroe explains various complex subjects using only the 1,000 most commonly used English words. And now, the book that brought all of you here today is How To, Absurd Scientific Advice for Common Real-World Problems, which has been dubbed by one reviewer as, quote, the world's most entertaining and useless self-help guide. With this book, you'll learn how to tell if you're a baby boomer or a 90s kid by measuring the radioactivity of your teeth, how to take a selfie with a telescope, cross a river by boiling it, and power your house by destroying the fabric of space-time. That's child's play, right? Tonight, Munroe will be in conversation with Alexandra Petri, a humorist and newspaper columnist who in 2010 became the youngest person to have a column in the Washington Post. She also runs the Compost blog on the paper's website and is the author of a memoir titled A Field Guide to Awkward Silences. Please help me welcome Alexandra Petri and Randall Munroe.
Oh, hooray. I'm so thrilled to be here. And this is so cool.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, I'm so excited you could be here. I'm a huge fan of your writing. So.
I'm a huge fan of your writing and your drawing. So, right back here. No, seriously, like, what got me through my college job where I would sit in the library behind the desk checking out people's books and trying not to judge them too much because we were instructed not to judge them too much, was I would just have XKCD up in the background all the time. And sometimes I checked people's books out wrong, but it didn't matter because I was learning and I was laughing. And so, yeah, I'm just flabbergasted and delighted. But so, this has been described as a book about bad ideas. What in 2019 made you think, what we need is more bad ideas? Let's have a whole book full of those.
Well, one thing that's fun is that sometimes it is hard to tell which ideas are bad for sure until you've tried them or at least thought about them for a little while. I feel like I don't start off trying to think of bad ideas or really even good ideas. I just try to think of ideas and then with each one be like, is that good or bad? I'm going to try to figure it out. And so with this, it's like I just turned off that filter a little bit. But
no bad ideas in brainstorming.
Yeah, exactly. Well, so I always think about the Curiosity rover, which they had to lower down onto Mars. Landing it on Mars was a huge challenge because it was really heavy, and none of the previous methods they used for landing it worked because the atmosphere was so thin. And so the rover, they couldn't use parachutes, it wouldn't slow it down enough, and they couldn't use those cushions to make it bounce because it was too heavy, and the cushions would, the airbags would burst. And they couldn't use rockets to make the rover kind of hover and touch down because they would kick up dust and the auto landing system wouldn't be able to cooperate with that. And they came up with the idea of lowering it from what they called a sky crane, which was like they sent it down with this hovering vehicle that had rockets on all the corners, but it stayed high up and it lowered the rover on this long tether toward the ground while it stayed hovering high up, not kicking up dust or anything. And it just lowered it like a fishing reel, lowered the rover all the way down to the ground, and then cut the tether, and the rover cut the tether. And then, and this is a really good thing, it's good that they thought about this, then they had the sky crane fire its engines to send it launching off sideways. It was no longer needed, But they did think about if they just, were like, okay, we don't need to worry about that anymore, it was going to run out of fuel and fall directly onto the rover, which would have been really funny, but a huge tragedy for science. But what I like about that idea is when they talked to the engineers and they had them describe it, they were like, that idea sounded ridiculous. But then we went over all of the other ideas we had, and it was less ridiculous than every other idea we could think of. And so they tried it, and it worked. And so sometimes it's hard to tell. And even when you do figure out that this idea is definitely bad, sometimes you learn something from it, from thinking about it, that'll help you with some other different problem. So, and if nothing else, it's just kind of fun.
Yeah. No, I think, because I often, whenever I have writer's block, I'm like, well, I'll just write the worst possible sentence that I can come up with, and then I'll write a slightly less bad sentence than that, and then hopefully, like 300 sentences later, I will have that first sentence I should have written in the first place.
Have you saved those sentences, though?
Well, I feel like I started doing this in like 5th grade, and so it was about Bambi, and I was like, Bambi is a terrible book, and I think everything got better from that point. And so like, Bambi epitomizes the woodland, or something. But somewhere on average between those two sentences, there was lurking.
There is a spectrum that encompasses all literature.
Yeah. No, exactly.
Yeah.
So you gotta start with the bad, work your way up. And so speaking of bad ideas, speaking of bad ideas is a terrible segue. Talk about your career. How did you decide this was a good idea?
Well, so I started out, I was studying physics at a small university in Virginia, Christopher Newport University, and I found an internship at the local, it was NASA Langley Research Center down in southeastern Virginia, and it turned out, it was a flyer on the wall, and I was not big on extracurricular activities or like paying attention in class 100% of the time, so I figured, I don't know, I don't have much on student activities, qualifications for this job or whatever. It turned out literally no one else from my school applied. And so they accepted me to this internship. And I worked there, and then someone there offered me a job in a robotics lab. And I was working there on a contract basis for a little while. So they offered me a job, but it was like a 90-day contract, and then they would, after the 90 days was up, they'd give me a new contract and a new contract.
The joys of millennial employment.
Yes, exactly. Well, so then at some point, I stopped working there. And this is something where I feel like if you look at different, times that I've told this story and it's been summarized by someone, you get very different versions of that.
We're going to get the full Rashomon.
Yeah.
Haven't pronounced that out loud. Not sure it was successful.
Yeah, I just tried to spell corrugated for the first time.
Oh, man.
And I realized I'd never tried to spell corrugated before. And I knew that because of how much confusion I had when I was like, what vowels are these?
Yeah. There are like 3 I's. You're like, this doesn't seem right, but I don't know how to fix it.
So some stories will say, like, at this point, he quit NASA to pursue internet cartoons. Other places will say, like, NASA did not renew his contract, and he, and then I've seen at least a few stories that was like after he was fired by NASA. So what happened? It is sort of ambiguous. So I had been drawing. So when I was in high school, I'd been drawing, in all my notebooks. Part of why my grades were not great was that I spent more time on like the doodles in the margins than on whatever was supposed to go in the middle. And so at some point I had these like notebooks that were kind of falling apart, and I thought, I have a website that I'm not doing anything with, like many people in the early 2000s, and I don't know what to put there, but I've got one. And so I started
circle links all around.
Yeah, exactly. The little under construction GIFs, etc. But so I decided to scan these doodles from my old notebooks because some of them were like cool charts I had made or little drawings with stick figures or something, and I put them in just like a folder on my website and was like, oh, people might want to browse this. And then people started linking those around to each other, and then before I knew it, people were like, hey, I really like this one, and so I started doing more of them, and then people would say, can I get this on a T-shirt, or can you make a poster of this or something? And before I knew it, I was like actually making some money from that, and it was potentially like, oh, do I want to focus on doing this more? So I was working at the same time on robotic navigation at this lab. And so my job was to program the robot that was our demonstration robot that was just going to show off how all these cool sensors it had. But really, my part of it was just I was trying to make it drive around in cool ways and not run into walls. And so I had programmed this algorithm where it would explore an open space. And this robot was like it had unnecessarily powerful motors. It was sort of cobbled together from cool hardware that different projects wanted to show off. So it could move in any direction really quickly. And I realized at some point that like, if I were trying to hold it, but also trying to drive it forward, like I'm not sure I could like restrain it.
It didn't know its own strength.
Exactly. It knew very little, let me tell you, as the person who was in charge of teaching it things. So there was a day, so I was very good about, I didn't draw comics, at work. I was not always like working really hard, but so now and then I will get letters from people who are like, oh yeah, I love your comics. I read them at work, when I'm supposed to be doing this. And I'm usually like, oh,
Shame.
that's cool. I had one person who said almost exactly that. And I was like, oh, that's really cool. Where do you work? And they were like, oh, I'm an assembly line inspector at, like, they were basically QA at a facility that produced missiles. I will not name the facility here or the person, but I was really tempted to go into the server and like block their address range from visiting my site. I was like, everyone else, delighted that you are reading my comics at work. You, please pay attention to your job. But I was not, doing comics at work. I was, but I, especially because drawing them at work feels like a little bit more of a faux pas than like just browsing them at work. But,
now taking circular notes, it's fine.
Yeah. But what I did do was I had programmed this wandering algorithm and I discovered the robot was, I had noticed that it had really powerful motors. And also, and this was one of those big old institutional buildings where it's like one continuous tile floor around the entire like facility. And also we had those office chairs with the wheels on the bottom. So I had the laptop that was connected to the robot, and the robot was the hub and the laptop was connected to the hotspot. And so I got some Cat5 cable and I made this like little harness and looped it over the top of the robot. And it was this R2-D2 size thing. And then I got onto the rolling chair and pulled my feet up and got the laptop on my lap. And I set the robot to wander. And then I hung on to the Cat5 Ethernet cable. And so the robot took off, towing me behind it. And it turns out it's more than capable of pulling a chair around. So it would like go, wandering randomly toward a wall, then turn around and like swing me behind it like a chariot. And then as I was supposed to, it continued exploring the space, found the door, and went out into the hallway. And I was like, yes, the exploring mode is working. This is really cool. And so it like just took off down the hallway, mostly continuing in a straight line. Like, this is an open space. I'm going to keep exploring it. And I'm towed behind it, like bouncing off of the walls occasionally, having a ton of fun. And it made it around the corner. It was a big, like, rectangular building, so you could walk around the corridor that ran around it. And I had actually never been to the other side of the building, because there were just offices, labs all the way down it. And so I went past a whole bunch of new labs very quickly, seeing all these people like working on other, presumably much more important projects. The one person inspecting the rockets. And so I got to go by and like, oh, hey, there's a lab here that oh, hi, nice to meet you. And I went past all these doors, and I made a full circuit of the building. Because I was very proud of myself, because my Explore algorithm, completely on its own, did a full circuit of the building that it had never before explored.
So this was an unqualified success, I think.
Yeah. So I don't know why NASA didn't renew my contract. But no, they were like, we've decided not to continue this project, but if you want to call so and so, we can find if there's a different project you can work on. Like, they were really nice about that, So I genuinely don't know how much it was. You're just riding a robot around our offices, and how much but at that point, people had been ordering stuff, and suddenly I was like spending a lot of time like getting T-shirts and shipping them to people and stuff. And so I just never called back to the person who they had offered to put me in touch with. And then now it's like, well over 10 years later. And I have still not called them back. But
they're still at any time. Did you say goodbye to the robot beforehand? Were you like, I've taught you well, go off into the world and like explore, be free, my son?
Yeah, I wonder, I mean, so it was like originally built by like my lab supervisor there, and then it would be funny to be like, I'm releasing you from captivity. Yeah. It's wrong to keep you caged up in here. And then just like put it in the like parking lot and set the wander mode and then like drive away. I wonder where that robot is.
Yeah. 10 years later, we've got a surprise guest for you tonight. Its name is, 011. He's got. I'm not sure how robots name themselves, but so I feel like this is a perfectly themed to the Bad Ideas book because it turned out to be a good idea, and it was a good idea throughout, and there were no problems with it. But what other ideas that you mentioned in the book, you're like, please don't try this at home because unlike me and my robot writing, it might not work out so well. But what would you like to see tried?
Fun one. I have a chapter on, based on this is one of the few ones in here that was based on a question someone sent in that was so cool that I wanted to write about it, which was about, like, could you extend a piano in either direction, like, infinitely far, so that you can play ever higher and ever lower notes? And so I got to look at, like, the physics constraints on playing really high and really low notes and what they're like. And I learned a bunch about infrasound and how, like, normal subwoofers can't produce really low notes, way below human hearing. Like, for the obvious reason that, like, the big subwoofer buying market is humans, I guess.
Yeah.
But
you could just sell one and say, it does make sounds below human hearing.
Well,
like, don't worry about it.
Yeah, like, how would they know if you were lying? So, but there is a cool specialized piece of equipment that can produce basically arbitrarily low notes, which is it's called a rotary woofer. And
that was my dog.
Yeah. And it's basically a fan, like a table fan, with blades that rotate to point either to blow air forward or to pull air backward. And they create a pressure wave in the air by, like, tilting the blades back and forth as it's spinning. So it's like it's blowing air, pulling air. And it can do like a 1 hertz note that way. Pushing air, pulling air. And these are cool because they travel all around, like they travel really far. Lower notes travel farther. And so one of the main things that people do infrasound monitoring for is, especially back in the early days of the Cold War, is monitoring for nuclear weapons tests. Because when you set off a nuclear weapon in the atmosphere, it sends out a pulse of this low-frequency sound that you can pick up all the way around the world. So there are these stations that have a, I assume it is just a computer now that no one needs to look at, but I imagine it being like one of those seismograph tapes, with the cool needle and stuff. But it'll print out, it'll show like patterns of sounds that are picked up. And since these sounds can travel so far, on one of the pages of this book, I have a piece of music, which is an infrasound piece of music that I call the infrasonata, which is, but it's a piece of piano music, but all of the notes are like a whole bunch of octaves below the actual, the staff, and it would be completely inaudible to humans. But if you built one of these rotary woofers and played it, and you played this piece of music, the individual notes are like many minutes long because you have to do that with low frequencies. If you play it, though, and someone at one of those nuclear monitoring stations is looking at their equipment at the time, it will draw a stick figure on their equipment. And I do kind of want someone to try that just to see if it works.
You should get the missile testing guy. Like, he should get promoted at work, and he should, like, reverse that somehow. But, no, well, speaking of cool things that you tried, I know you got some help from Serena Williams to test out one of your chapters. Can you please talk about that?
So I had a chapter that was on, it was on how to catch a drone. And the idea is that, like, when you see one of those little wedding photography drones, like, flying around, it always bugs me that you can't, like, when you can't tell who's flying it, even if it's, like, benign, but it's like, someone is looking at me and they're doing it secretly. It's like a masked person pointing a telescope at you. And, like...
Yeah, it's like, why is the mask necessary?
Yeah, that person could be doing it for a very normal reason, I guess. But like, I would like to know the reason. Thank you. And so and there are all these cool, ideas for how to shoot down drones. And there's technologies. There are these net guns that shoot, nets with like weights on the edge, like the Roman Colosseum type thing. There's ideas for jamming them. There's this really unwise idea about using eagles to grab drones out of the sky, which does sound really cool until you like add up the number of eagles in the world and number of drones in the world, and then start to think more about the idea of solving a problem of humans who are misusing vehicles and machinery by training relatively endangered animals to hurl themselves into that machinery. Like, ultimately is like not gonna solve the problem, and may create some new ones. But what I was thinking was like, if I'm just in my backyard and there's a drone there, what if all I have is just like sports equipment? And so I started wondering about, in general, what's the best piece of sports equipment if you want to hit something that's floating in the air? Because like a baseball seems good because it's like hard and you throw it fairly accurately and you can throw it very fast. A basketball, though, it's easier to throw up, and they're also bigger, so you have more margin for error for hitting things. And so I started developing this model for like taking equipment from every different sport and like how accurate would it be at hitting targets at a given distance and a given size. And I found all these studies that would get, and it was usually like professional players, to throw baseballs at a target or kick soccer balls at a target on a wall, and it would give their like average error and all this like mathematical analysis. And I was adding this up, pulling up studies from random different fields. And so I knew Serena Williams' husband, Alexis Ohanian, who started Reddit way back in the day, and published I did an XKCD collection. It was sort of semi-self-published in that it was published by Alexis and his like personal company that he and a friend had started, which had never published a book before. But we're like, yeah, I bet we could do that.
It's technically other published,
we published it. Yeah, it was fun. But but sometimes people don't count it as like one of my books. Whatever. I don't care. But I don't care which way you categorize that. But it had fallen out of touch. But we had texted about something recently, and so I mentioned I was working on this thing, and I was currently searching for a paper on tennis. And he texted back like, oh, cool. Hey, if you're writing a thing about tennis, let us know if there's any way we can help. And I was like, yes. So he was like, yeah, sure. If there's any cool, experiment we can do, or something, if you get some, if you're looking for data, I was like, yeah, I'm actually, so I'm looking for data on tennis accuracy. So I asked if Serena would be willing to like, she's very busy. She has an important career. She has a whole bunch of different projects. She has a whole investment thing. She has, that are all on top of all the, tournaments she's playing in. Possibly she's also supposed to be inspecting missiles. I don't know. So I was figuring like, okay, I don't want to, I'm not going to ask too much of her time. What's the minimum, request I can make? And I was like, okay, so I've got this chapter. I'm looking at hitting drones with projectiles and I want accuracy data. So when you're practicing, is there any chance you could like put a target on a wall somewhere and just like videotape, just get the measurements of like how far away it is, and then serve a bunch of tennis balls as close to the target as possible, and send me that data, and then I can have a model for like a comparable model for the professional players of the other sports that I've been using. And then so they wrote back to that like, we have a drone. Do you want us to just try? So, long story short, they went out onto the field, and her husband had an old drone with a broken camera that they were willing to sacrifice for this project. And so he flew it up over the court, and she took up her position by the baseline and served at it. So I had a model where I could plug in, and they were like, yeah, we're going to try this floating, sort of middle of the court, and she'll be back here at the normal service position. And so my model suggested that from that distance, my guess for a pro tennis player was that it would take about 5 to 7 serves to hit this particular drone model. It was one of those very slender ones, and if you're hitting it edge on, it doesn't provide a large target area. And so she set up, and she said, so first he flew the drone up over her head, and she said, which she said was completely unreasonable because tennis players don't serve straight up. And so she made him move it down to somewhere that she could serve more comfortably toward. And then her first two serves missed, and then the third one nailed one of the side propellers, and it did a very dramatic like spiral and crash onto the ground.
It burst into flame.
Yeah, flipped over. Yeah. And she just burst out laughing, and I've got a great picture of the drone lying on the ground, which I basically reproduced in the book. And then I got to ask her, so like, and I sort of felt reluctant. I was like, so how do you feel about this as an anti-drone strategy? Do you think this is a good idea? And she was like, I don't think it's a very good idea.
Yeah, I got to get back to the bald eagles because this
Yeah.
is a waste of Serena Williams' precious efforts.
Yeah.
No.
But I was, and then she weighed in a little bit more about like, and she was like, honestly, she said drones don't bother me very much, because usually when there's one around, I know it's generally my husband flying it, so I don't worry about them. But
so that's an alternative relaxing strategy. Just assume that it's Mr. Serena Williams flying the drone.
Exactly.
Feel reassured. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's a harmless Alexa.
Well, and I talked to a robot ethicist, Dr. Kate Darling.
Now, to be clear, it's a human being who's a robot ethicist, not a robot
every time I say
ethicist.
That, yeah. Because Serena commented that like, oh yeah, she didn't, she doesn't worry about robots. She just kind of felt bad hurting it. And, but I totally felt the same way. And I know I'm, guilty of anthropomorphizing robots to a great extent sometimes. But, I've done a few comics about them. And in fact, when I sent, so I talked to Kate Darling about this, and she pointed out that there were several places in totally unrelated chapters where I had drawn drones as like, there was one that was like a drone getting tired and falling to the ground, and someone coming, picking up and cradling it.
Poor little guy.
Like,
yeah.
Drew that completely not even thinking of the Serena chapter. It's just like, oh, poor guy. So yeah, she felt bad about that, and I felt bad about that, and so I got to talk to this ethicist about like, is it okay to hit drones? Is this wrong? And she had a really good perspective on it. It was like, the way you treat things that seem to be alive will definitely affect how other people see you. And that's something to think about. Like, if you seem to enjoy hurting something that seems to be alive, that, like, suggests things about you that you might want to think about, that.
Yeah.
And then also pointed out that, like, we really tend to project agency onto these drones when really the problem is the people who are in charge of them. So, if someone's bothering you with a drone and all you have is a tennis racket, you could try finding the person flying it and serve the ball at them.
Yeah. I think that's a good ethical solution to this problem. No, I have the same problem with Alexa because my husband's on the end of the S-curve where you think all technology is good and is coming to save you. And so we have like several Alexas in the house. And I'm always like, this is bad because if we do a murder, we can be subpoenaed. And he
Well, okay. I was on your side up until just now.
Well, I feel like I shouldn't have gone straight to that use case, but, you have to consider
That's
it.
a really good argument for you having an Alexa in your house.
Yeah, no, I'm very polite to the Alexa so that she won't, yeah, see, here we go. So it won't turn me in when the time comes. But, no, there's so much I want to ask, and I'm also trying to keep cognizant on time. But so you did a number of very cool interviews, which is why you got to read the book. Buy the book. I guess I'm preaching to the choir here. But you also talked to Chris Hadfield about how to land things safely.
Yes, that was a lot of fun. So I had a chapter on how to do an emergency landing, and to write this, I got in touch with Colonel Chris Hadfield, former commander of the International Space Station, and also a test pilot with the military in both Canada and the U.S., who has flown like 100 different aircraft, and is like, And so I got to come up with a list of the most ridiculous situations you might find yourself in trying to land something, and got an interview with him where I got to ask him, like, one after another, what would you do in this situation? And I figured I would start with the simplest one and then work my way up to more ridiculous, up until the point where he said, "This is the dumbest thing I've ever been asked," and then like hung up on me. And I figured there'd be a lot more back and forth, but I would ask a question and he would just answer it. And then, so I started off with, like, if you were flying and you had to land in a farmer's field because there was nowhere else, which crop would you aim for? Like a big one that provides a lot of drag, like corn, or a low to the ground one like strawberries, or something that's more like a runway. And he was just like, and he has that astronaut cadence, the very, like, everything's measured, nothing is out of the ordinary, air traffic control. And he was just like, well, I fly small planes, and that's the kind of thing we think about all the time. When you're driving to the airfield, you look around at the fields and you see, have they brought in their hay bales? How high are the beans? If I had to come down there, would I be able to land? Has it rained recently? Because you can't land in a muddy field. And then he started listing off all the different crops and what times of year it's okay to land in them. Apparently, this and this, and corn is okay to land in up until about the middle of June. So I started asking the weirder and weirder questions, and he kept on giving answers that had no hesitation. And I would ask him about, like, could you land on a moving train, like a passenger train? Because I know you can land on aircraft carriers, but what about a train? And he was like, oh yeah, people have done that. Flatbed trucks too. You see that at air shows sometimes. But what you need to look out for is the motion of the train as you touch down will tend to want to bump you off to one side. So when you touch down, you then have to touch down very firmly, or you'll get jostled off. Next question, please. And I worked my way up through asked him about, like, bad landing scenes in disaster movies and a bunch of other stuff. And I was sort of surprised by the ones that he was just like, no, I don't think that would be survivable, because I asked about, like, the train, and he was like, oh yeah, that's easy. And then I was like, what about landing on one of those ski jumps at the Olympics, and slide back down? And he said, no, I don't think you could do that. And then he laid out, like, maybe, and then he said, if you have the stands are low enough and you come in really low and then pull up at just the right time, you might be able to stall right in line with the slope and then slide back down. But I don't think your odds would be good, and you would only get one try. And so he laid out all of these answers. But my favorite thing, and so I got to ask him things like, if you had your sleeve locked in the cockpit door and you had to steer the plane by throwing stuff at the controls. Or what if you got locked on the outside of the plane and you had to steer it by, would you crawl around and try to move the flaps by hand or what, And he answered all of these. And so I had to, and I figured I was, bothering him. Same with Serena Williams, because he was, I knew he had a flight. And I don't mention this in the book, but this interview took place while he was on a layover between two flights. And we had about an hour to talk. And so he was standing in a terminal, in a corner of the terminal where he could chat with me. And then I realized, he was like, oh yeah, my flight will be boarding at this time. And so I knew he had to board, and I kept on being like, okay, hey, listen, I really appreciate all this time. And I can follow up with any other questions. And he's like, oh no, I got plenty of time. They haven't called my group yet. Next question. Because he's so, such a professional astronaut, it took me a while to realize he was really enjoying answering the questions. And so he continued answering them. And then at one point he was like, hang on, they've got to scan my boarding pass. And I was like, okay, listen, I'll let you go. And he was like, no, I'll be right back. And then he continued talking to me as he walked down the jetway. And then I heard him get into the plane and start walking down the aisle, continuing to answer my questions. And at that point, I basically had to hang up on him because all I could think was the passengers who boarded in the groups ahead of him and were hearing him walk by. Well, if I were stuck on the outside of the plane, I think what I'd do is crawl back to the tail. You can control the plane from the tail. The flaps are too heavy to move by hand, but you can grab the trim tab. And I was just like, okay, I'll follow up by email. Bye. So I think that ended up being my very favorite chapter in the book, and mostly because I was going to write a whole normal chapter about it, but I ended up just transcribing frantically everything he said and then illustrating it.
Oh man, I feel like 3 people on the plane were like, we feel safe, we're in good hands. And the other 147 were just like, man, I hope it's June and it's corn. But, oh, that's amazing.
It's so much, yeah, I had so much fun with that.
No, so as long as we're in DC, which we're going to continue to be out for the rest of the evening, unless something goes horribly wrong with all of the room mechanics. Like I said, I was last year taking geometry over the summer, so this is not my physics field. But so politics, broadly speaking, you told us how in the book to become elected if we're named Bob Casey. That's a key, easy strategy and one that's readily embraceable. But what if we're not Bob Casey and we want to get elected? Like, what hope do we have?
Yeah, well, so I do have a whole section on how to try to trick people into picking your name on the ballot. But if that doesn't work, you gotta convince people to vote for you, and that's hard and complicated because people are strange and no one ever really seems to know what they're gonna do next. But as a very general strategy, I figure you're supposed to be in favor of things that people like and against things that people don't like. But finding out what people like and what they don't like is tricky, because like what my friends like might be different from what other people like. And so the way that you usually do this is opinion polling. And so it's easy to look at what will play best with our voters and, against their voters. And you can use polls to pander. But I was curious, what if you want to just pander to everybody? And so I wanted to know, what are the least controversial positions you could take as a politician? And so I reached out to the Roper Center for Public Opinion, which is an archive of every poll that's been conducted since telephone polling began in the 30s. So they have
telephone polling.
Yeah.
Sorry.
So that they have 700,000 questions that have been asked in scientific surveys of the general American public. And so I had them go through and find things that everyone agreed on. And what's really tricky about this is that you don't really bother polling a question if it's uncontroversial. Someone has to pay to do the question. So all of the questions in their database are things that someone paid money to find out what the American people thought about them. And you never get 100% of people picking any option in any poll. Because there's always someone who misunderstands the question or is just answering to make jokes. But what I got them to do is go through their database and pull up every question that had more than 95% agreement from the general American public on an issue that they were polled on. Now, so these are actual questions asked in surveys. They include, 95% of Americans disapprove of people talking on cell phones in movie theaters. 97% think that there should be laws against texting while driving. 96% have a positive impression of small business. 95% believe that employers should not be able to access the DNA of their employees without permission.
95% specific question.
95% support laws against money laundering that involves terrorism. 95% think that doctors should be licensed. Another 95% think that support going to war if the U.S. is invaded. 96% are against legalizing crystal meth. 95% are satisfied with their current friends. 95% also say that, and the question was, if a pill were available that made you twice as good looking but half as smart, would you take it? 95% say no. This is... that's a popular position. 98% believe lifeguards should watch swimmers rather than reading or talking on the phone. 99% think that it's wrong for employees to steal large, expensive equipment from their workplace for use at home. 95% think it's wrong to pay someone to do a term paper for you. 98% would like to see a decline in hunger in the world. 97% would like to see a decline in terrorism and violence. So there's that 1% there. 98% would like to see a decline in high unemployment. 97% would like to see an end to all wars. 95% do not believe magic 8 balls can predict the future. And 96% think that the Olympics are a great sports competition. So I was like, okay, so here's the platform if you want to run. These are all the things you're in favor of if you want to be the most electable, candidate, at least according to scientifically conducted polling. But then I also realized you could use this, but you could take the opposite position and come up, if you support what the 1% and 2% and 3% support in all those polls, you could have the absolute worst political platform possible. So I wrote a short campaign speech. So now this is the worst political platform possible. A vote for me is a vote for high unemployment, war, workplace theft, and texting while driving. I believe that every citizen's voice should be heard in every movie theater in this country. And if elected, I vow to put an end to the Olympics once and for all. My administration will raise taxes on small businesses and use the money to install a video game console in every lifeguard chair in the country. We will manufacture and sell crystal meth and use the proceeds to give tax credits to anyone who practices medicine without a license. We will engage in money laundering, but only to support terrorism. Every decision in my administration will be made by magic 8-ball. And if our country is invaded, I will surrender immediately. Vote for me if you love hunger. Vote for me if you hate your friends. And if you vote for me, I promise you this. Every one of you will be twice as attractive and half as smart.
Oh, man. Well, I'm sold. I, for one, look forward to... I want to know about the person who demanded, I want to see if I take a large piece of equipment from the office, if they will mind.
I read that. I looked at that poll that came from because I was curious, too. And what they were doing is they were trying to gauge, the norms around, borrowing stuff from your workplace. And they were like, is it okay to use, workplace equipment to do, print stuff out or something? Is it okay to take minor office supplies? Is it okay to take, some of these, larger things like a ream of printer paper or something? And then, is it okay to steal, computers and scientific equipment to sell at home? And they were, trying to establish, what are the, what's the sliding scale? And that was the extreme end of the scale where everyone was like, okay, that's definitely wrong.
Yeah. We all agree. I also got some questions from the audience written on index cards here. And we're going to go rapid fire. It's going to be wild and exciting. So, what does XKCD stand for?
Deliberately nothing. I picked it back when I was getting an AOL screen name, which I first did in 1993. And I was picking names based on whatever cool book series I was reading at the time. I had Skywalker 4 for a while. But then every time I found a new thing I was into, I had to change my name, and that got really inconvenient. And at some point I realized we keep identifying things that we do with these strings of text that have to be unique across everything. I should pick one that doesn't have a meaning to it so I can use that everywhere, and that's short, but won't be taken. And I had a bunch of other criteria, and then I tried names to see which ones were unregistered on a bunch of different services, and XKCD was free. So I just staked out my spot in the space of 4-character long strings of letters.
Got in while the going was good. What is a how-to that you wanted to get into the book but didn't make it?
I did one on, I wrote a chapter on how to dry out your cell phone if it gets wet. And I had the basic thing about the bag of rice, where you put the phone in a bag of rice. That doesn't work great. I had other ideas that would technically remove the water from the phone, but also most of the phone parts. Those were fun. But I really wasn't satisfied with the answer to the actual question of but really, what should I do if I dry out my phone? And so I ended up having to cut that one because at least my chapter on how to ski also doesn't give you very much useful information on how to ski. But
there are that. I'm this isn't helpful.
Yeah, but there are other people who will teach you how to ski. It's very easy to find them. If you want to learn how to ski and you're reading this book, you're already probably in trouble. So but how to dry your phone is a thing that if I drop a phone in the water, I'm panicked. I want to know the answer. And it would be helpful if someone would write a thing that really firmly answered it. And I didn't have a good answer.
So, what is the most absurd phrase or equation you've ever found yourself entering into Wolfram Alpha?
Oh, I have entered a lot of weird stuff into Wolfram Alpha over the years to do calculations. There was one actually recently that I first tried entering into Google, and it didn't work, and then I had to go and do a complicated equation in Wolfram Alpha. I was trying to figure out if you were moving. I thought it would be easier to move if you picked up instead of having to pack all your stuff into boxes, just leave the stuff in the house and just pick up the whole house and move it. Which people do sometimes. Usually they do take the stuff out first. But, and I was trying to figure out, okay, if you're driving down the highway, pulling your house with your car, like on one of those flatbeds or something, what kind of gas mileage would the vehicle get? And I couldn't find the answer to that because it's just not a thing people commonly want to know. So I Googled like suburban house gas mileage or something, thinking, oh yeah, maybe this will point me to a resource. And Google was like, I got the redirect where they're like, okay, you're clearly asking how much heating gas a house uses. And I was like, that is a very reasonable interpretation of what I'm typing in. But no, I wanted the other thing. And so I had to do the drag calculations myself.
That's great. Oh man. So I've got, what would be the best thing to hit a pro wrestler over the head with? Or what about the state of the world makes you most nervous and or gives you the most hope? So answer either one of those, and you don't have to explain which one you're answering.
I don't know. I feel like answering the nervous one is the easiest, but also like a huge downer. I think I'm excited. What gives me a lot of hope is when I do comics about, these topics that I'm reading about that I think are cool, but, I've learned some cool thing about science or some scientific study, that I think is really interesting, and I do a comic about it. Getting to, first of all, not only learn that there are other people out there who are also think that this is cool. My favorite part is I will often hear from the person who did the study, and they'll be like, yes, this is really cool. Let me show you what else we've learned. And, I get to learn a whole bunch of new stuff. And, realizing that when you sit alone reading, going down rabbit holes of, reading research papers, you can forget that, these are all real people out there trying to do a good job at what they're doing and, trying to figure stuff out about the world. And, I don't know, whenever I meet people who work on the kind of research that I've been reading and talking about, I'm always like, oh man, these are all, people, and we're all, actually working on this stuff together, and we're all in this together. Maybe we can figure things out. I don't know. That does give me hope. Yeah. I guess
no, there's nothing
it counteracts all the many things that are downers.
There's nothing like being in a room full of people who are excited about the same things you're excited about.
Yeah.
And on that note, I think, are we at time, or can I keep firing questions at you?
Yeah, where are we?
Somebody wave at me. Oh,
yeah,
4. Okay, great. How long does an average comic take to write?
Oh man, writing, the drawing is very it's easy to tell how long a comic will take to draw, and this is for people who do complicated cartoons or simple ones, because it's just a function of the number of lines and the number of complicated things in it. Plus, double the time if I have to draw an airplane. There are a couple of objects that have geometric shapes that have lots of angles that aren't really right angles or have a simple geometry, and those it takes me 20 tries.
It's like human hands. They're wrong.
Exactly.
Something about them is wrong.
So I've figured out a cool trick to avoid having to draw human hands. No, but the writing can be anything from I have ideas that I wrote down the first part of 5 years ago, and they've been sitting there, and I keep coming back to them and being can I figure out how to make this work? No, I can't, and then I leave it alone. There was also, I did one on climate change recently, a couple of years ago, that was a chart of the Earth's temperature over time, trying to show how when people say, well, we know the climate has changed before, that those changes they're talking about are very different from what's happening now, and that statement should be less reassuring than terrifying, because here's what it looked like when the climate changed before. But I knew this was such a contentious topic that I wanted to get it right, and I ended up spending about 2 years on that comic, off and on, trying different things, being well, no, this doesn't quite show this correctly, or this simplification isn't, I'm not comfortable with, I want to do it this way instead, and running it by climatologists and getting their feedback. Some of those comics, they can take as long as you want to write. But then the actual drawing of the line, it was a very tall comic, so it took a little while, but it wasn't that bad.
That's I think that when they made Chernobyl, they're and the most accurate chart for how much radiation you get from things is from XKCD. So it pays off.
Yeah, that was a cool chart. I did. I posted it on my website. I did that in collaboration with a friend of mine, and she was Ellen McManus, who worked as a research reactor. And she was I'm trying to figure out a way to show people what different amounts of radiation mean, and do you have any ideas on how to make a chart of this? And so we worked on that together. And she ensured that I was actually giving correct information about radiation, and I figured out ways to make it look cool to look at.
Because you don't want bad information about radiation.
Yeah, there are a few topics where I will either like steer clear of making assertions about them, even if I feel like I understand them, and also where I will definitely go and consult with experts, which is against every instinct I have because I'm very prone to sit in my room and not talk to people and just read things. But yeah, when it's anything that's around really what's the best way to handle this situation in terms of health or safety or whatever. Or what's the political consequences of doing this? I always like to try to bring it.
Yay, experts. So, hey, we lost Pluto in name only, but how many planets could we actually lose, parentheses, disappear, without significantly affecting life on Earth? Chris and Jonah want to know.
I think we could lose all of them except ours. It would be boring, but they aren't doing anything for us. Early on in the solar system, Jupiter was really helpful in that it the gravity shaped how it formed and probably protected our inner planets from asteroids and helped eject a lot of the junk from the solar system before it hit Earth. Also probably sent big showers of meteors toward us now and then and completely obliterated the face of the planet. But that was early on. There was nothing really important there before. Although, so people say that's about the period from the first 0.6, 0.7 billion years the Earth was around, before what they call the late heavy bombardment. They're like, oh yeah, and as far as we know, there was nothing important there. There was nothing too interesting there, which is funny because the surface of the Earth was, as far as we can tell, pretty much obliterated and turned completely molten. So there really might have been something important there. I've always been fascinated by that period.
Yeah, it's
but no.
If it's on fire, it probably didn't matter that much now. We're going to assume that wasn't precious pre-Cambrian something. Where do your worst ideas come from?
Man, definitely the same place as my best ideas. Just it's about the quality of the filter. I'm never trying to make good or bad ideas. I'm just trying to come up with ideas, and then some of them are very obviously the bad ones.
So this is a cool question, and I'm not sure what my answer would be, is if you had a single-use time machine, one round trip, that's good clarification, and there's a drawing on it, it's really cool. Which era would you visit, and why? And what, if anything, would you bring back with you?
I have a couple of comics about how, obviously the thing you're supposed to do with this is go and kill Hitler. That's the cliche time machine answer. There's a great Saturday Morning Breakfast cereal strip about this, in which Hitler gets so good at killing time travelers that that then when the future time travelers try to come back and stop time travel from being invented, they have to enlist the only person who can kill the future time travelers by going back in time to rescue him. Anyway, I think that might be my favorite of his strips that he's ever... But no, I think, assuming I don't choose to, prevent some very important tragedy, or, in some other way help out, basically every character in every time travel story has also neglected to do, I would totally go back to right before the late heavy bombardment to check out what's on the surface of the Earth.
You would have to time that one very carefully, though. You don't want me to start at late heavy bombardment,
But it's an early period in the Earth's history, but it's also 0.6 billion years, which is also roughly the amount of time that multicellular life has really existed on Earth. So it's a small window of time in terms of the Earth's overall history, but so is everything that we've ever so is the history of complex life. Still a lot of time for stuff to happen in there. So I would check it out. Definitely need to bring breathing masks because we didn't get oxygen until 1.5 billion years later.
Yeah, no, it's important. Details, as my dad always says. So, what is your favorite astronomical event or discovery in recent years? I'm an astronomer, so I hope it's mine, the questioner asks.
Man, well, I know that just playing the odds, I've seen the publication list for that recent black hole image, and the number of co-authors that had, I think, was like more. It was certainly more than any other scientific paper I've ever seen. So if I'm trying to pick the one that is most likely to include the person who asked that question, I'd say the black hole photo. And that one was. I thought it was really cool when they picked up the waves from the gravitational waves from the black holes merging. Not even really because it detected gravitational waves, because like all the physics, like theory people kind of assumed that they existed. But because it confirmed that black holes existed, which we had never actually like directly observed, and this was the first direct observing. But I did also. This isn't really a discovery, but I did go and see the total solar eclipse from within the path of totality, and I had
totality.
Well, and like it's completely different. Like people who saw it, I feel like seeing the eclipse from outside the path is sort of like it's seeing the full moon set behind a city, where it like looks really cool, and I would go outside to see it and stuff, and maybe drive a ways, but I wouldn't like travel for it, you know. But seeing it in the path of totality, I have had that eclipse in 2017 on my Google Calendar since 2009 with friends who I was like, if we are still friends, I have plans. What are you going to be doing in 8, years from now? And they're like, I will hopefully be out of college, you know. So I was very excited for this, and I went with a couple of friends, including an astronomer and stuff. And so I had high expectations, and it was far and away the coolest thing I've ever seen. Like I think it was like even cooler than I expected. So like that was my first. Other people had seen them before, but getting to see it firsthand was definitely the coolest space thing I've ever experienced. Probably the coolest thing of any time.
Oh man, I feel very all summer in a day about that because I missed it. I was in like not the past.
So there's another one in 2024, and the problem is it is April, and in April it'll go across like basically the northeastern U.S. and like upstate New York and all this stuff. And I definitely recommend trying to see it in a natural like area without as many people or buildings or stuff, so you can see the animals react. But in April, the odds that the sky will be blocked by clouds in most of the Northeast is something like 60-70%. So you got to plan a more complicated trip. And so Southwest Texas is good. I don't want to give away where I'm going. Like,
yeah, I know.
I want to like pick a place that's going to be like it's like the game theory of like where are other people not going to go. If you have family, friends, or if you're from who live in Mexico, the southwest coast of Mexico looks like the perfect spot. So if you want to make it an international trip that possibly lots and lots and lots of other people will be making at the same time, causing havoc at the airports and everything, that'd be the place to go.
That's good information to have about the eclipse. I guess, what is the best way to escape a locked room? About which we have no further details. That's the extent of our...
I'm so deeply reassured by the fact that door appears to be propped open.
Yeah. So summon the robot, and...
So...
Okay. That person made it out. Yes.
So, no, I think part of why I like physics is that you get to, whenever you have a practical problem, whenever you have a theoretical problem that's too hard, you can be like, well, what actual case are we looking at here? Let's make this more concrete and more practical. I don't care about the theoretical solving this, theoretically, because I can approximate it through this other technique. But then also when practical problems get too challenging, you can abstract them and get a theoretical solution. So I would definitely just switch to a coordinate system where the interior of the room is everything else, and then crossing through the wall, that's inside. So we're outside here. The rest of the universe is inside, and under this coordinate system, it's actually quite small. We can just that's the rest of it is negligible. Most of space is in here, and hey, look, we're outside now.
Oh, good. Well, we can apply that to climate change, and it will solve everything. No.
Yeah.
Do the Emily Dickinson mode of like escape with your mind from your locked room. So, I'm a teacher in middle school. I'm not, but the question here is, what was the most inspiring or motivating thing any of your teachers did for you while you were in school?
Well, I wasn't. Wait. Like when I was at home?
I think, like when you were in middle school, like what your teachers doing that was inspiring and motivating.
Wait, when I wasn't.
When you were in school.
Oh, I heard when you weren't in school.
When you weren't in school.
And I was like, well, the one time I was playing in my backyard and one of my teachers just walked out of the woods and gave me an inspiring speech about it.
It was a key moment.
No. I had this idea that I was interested in science. And then there were a few years where I had a couple of years of science classes in a row where I realized I didn't really like what we were working on, and I didn't like what we had worked on, in the semester before, and it had been a couple of years, and I had always disliked the science classes I was in, and I started thinking I had this idea that I liked science, but I don't really know where that came from. Maybe I don't like science, maybe I'll go into something else. Maybe I'll do foreign languages or something. And so I had sort of started to drift in that direction. And then I, at some point, asked a question, and a teacher, after class or something, because I was curious how some of the teachers said. And the teacher was like, you know what, I don't know the answer to that, but it's in one of these books, and pulled down what turned out to be a physics textbook. And I was flipping through to find the section and realized, literally every other page was something that I had been wondering about, or was excited about, or was and I was like, oh, this is where all the science that I'm really interested in is. And it was cool to see that it wasn't that I had the wrong mindset or whatever. It was it wasn't I was interested in science. It just was an area of science that wasn't in any of the classes I had taken. And then that totally I did a course correct right at that moment and went into ultimately a physics degree. And it it's still and since then I've branched out and I've learned more about some of the other areas of science, and they're all really cool. But having a teacher just say I think I know what you're interested in, let me go find a book about it, was really made a huge difference.
You're like, oh, this is where all the physics live. This is where all the cool stuff is. Yeah. What have you been doing all day? But no, I like how you the coolest thing a teacher ever did for me was hand me a book unrelated to their instruction.
I mean, if we're being serious, I also had there were some years where I was in a school that really wasn't a good fit for me, and and I wasn't an oldest child, so my parents who were academics sort of sorting out how does this work? And there was one teacher, and it was we moved, and I was and I did have a teacher who was he never talks in class, and he's always just reading a book and ignoring everything. I can't get him to do any work, but I think there's something I think that he's in the wrong place, and there's this other school nearby that might be good for him. And she actually got my parents in and told them hey, listen, I really think this is a good idea. This is important, and sold them on. And my parents were oh, we didn't know there were other schools, or it was. And she walked them through this process, and that definitely made a huge difference. So that's the real legitimate. Probably the thing that was the most helpful and inspiring was a teacher who just figured things out and then went and had to talk to my parents and help them figure out how to navigate it. Yeah, and that did mean a lot.
And how can we help more people fall in love with science? Or fall in love with the help of science? That's another alternative that this questionnaire has proposed.
Oh man.
Yeah, pheromones, go wild.
Helping people fall in love with science, it's hard because I really feel like there's a lot of what I think is good-natured rivalry between different fields of study, and I've totally engaged in a lot of that on behalf of physics, where I came out of, which I thought was the best science. That's why I majored in it. But at some point I sort of started to realize that maybe some of the good-natured ribbing was only going in one direction, and also some of the other some of the people in physics were a little more serious about it than I was comfortable with, and so I've tried to dial that back. So I don't necessarily when people are why is it more important to get more kids into science? And I'm I don't know that it's necessarily more important than the other things that kids could be doing. I don't know a lot about those other fields, and I feel like you should have like, here's why I think the stuff that I learn about is really cool. But I want to have people who like are learning about other stuff who explain why that other stuff is really cool. There are a whole bunch of things that you've talked about that I never even knew.
It's mostly fun facts about Gore Vidal, but
yes.
like I appreciate that.
Yeah,
English majors represent. The lobby of English Majors International paid you to make that remark, and we appreciate it. And it was what we put all of our degree money towards, and now that's the end. It won't be used for anything else.
Yeah, but yeah, so I don't know. I can talk about like why the stuff I think is interesting is really interesting, but like I get a little bit suspicious when people are like, we need to get kids into science, and because there's sort of an implicit like, and get them out of something left unsaid, and I sort of wonder. I'd like to dig in a little bit more to what that other thing is, like what it is that we want kids to be going into science instead of.
Yeah. If they find out about ancient Greek, it's going to be all over for society. Man, things are just going to start breaking down willy-nilly right and left. But they're going to be using the symbols to write all kinds of different things.
What would you, if you could add something to the curriculum in every school in the country, somewhere in like the grade school period, like one year, one course, or one subject?
Ooh.
Now, I'm sure you have a very responsible answer. So what's the other one?
Oh, the other one. Well, what's funny is my responsible answer was also going to be my irresponsible answer, because I'm like, well, so I love a good book that has just like the genre of the book is there's a plot kind of, but also there's a whole section that somebody's just giving you bad facts that they think are true about a subject like farming in Russia or whales, or like whale facts that may or may not be true, but they're really excited about them, or like the sewers of Paris, or the Battle of Waterloo, just like 200 pages of what they think maybe happened at the Battle of Waterloo. And so I feel like everyone should be required to read one novel in that genre. So it's just like, here's 50% of this is like my cover of King Lear, and the other 50% of it is like bad facts about whales. Congratulations, we've read Moby Dick. And then just quiz them on the whale facts exclusively. I feel like just really drill into them that the important thing is knowing what Herman Melville thought were facts about whales. But yeah, what's your irresponsible curriculum edition?
Oh man. Weirdly, I feel like I only had ones that I've thought like were responsible.
Or it could be like a new experiment, because I feel like there's always the one thing that you're like, I don't know why we were required to do that and why it was so much of our grade that we had to drop an egg off of like 8 buildings and make it land safely. But like the equivalent of that. Like build a Viking ship, maybe it floats.
Yeah, you know what? There are actually a couple of things that are like kind of safety or like cautionary procedures. This is like a very serious answer. Like I'm serious about where like I don't know how it happened that we all learned stop, drop, and roll, or at least I did. For if you catch on fire, what you do is you stop, drop, and roll, and I mean, I have known people who have caught on fire. It happens now and then, especially if you know the people who do the thing where they spin fire on strings. But I feel like it's not that common in occurrence. So there are a couple of things where I feel like everyone should be drilled on, like, here are the 3 steps or the 3 signs or 3 whatever, like, or a few of these things, like stop, drop, and roll. Noticing the signs that a cut or wound has become infected is one that I've known a couple of people who almost died because it's like, oh yeah, there's redness spreading up my arm, but it's probably nothing important,
Yeah.
Or like, that's weird. I don't know why my arm is red and sore and why I feel like my bones feel a little bit sore and I feel chills and I'm running a little bit of a fever. And there's this redness spreading toward the middle of my body. Like, I think we could really use a rhyme on that.
Yeah, like red arm means harm.
Yeah.
Chills in the body.
Yeah.
That's pretty shoddy. I'm just saying that the symptoms are bad for you, not that they'll kill you.
And also, oh man, this is, not to end. We should do one more question after this, at least, not to end on a total downer. Man, red flags for a controlling relationship. That one would be so easy to teach. Because there's like 3 of them and they come up every time. And, like the isolating you from your friends, suspicion, constant suspicion, and then there's like 2 others, and you could have a rhyme for that. And honestly, teaching that to little kids, and the same like catching on fire, also very bad for you, very harmful. Good to teach, important to teach kids not to do it, what to do when it happens, And like I do feel like that would be a similar to what to do if you catch on fire, and like similarly important. Right, it's just harmful,
Yeah.
So I actually, that one was...
That's an earnest and great one. I'm trying to think of a good mnemonic for that, other than like, to use the metaphor from, I think, Captain Awkward, where it's like Darth Vader boyfriend, where it's like, if you find yourself saying about the person things that Luke says about Darth Vader, you know that you're in a bad scenario, where it's like, if you just saw the person that I see, you'd know he could be redeemed. And it's like, nope, get out of that relationship. But yeah, Captain Awkward has excellent advice along that vein. But let's find a question that isn't about harmful relationships and go forth and conquer. So, what was the first comic you drew?
So
it was about harmful relationships. And
I actually remember. So it had to have been after I remember the first comic I read, which is weird because I don't really remember like the first of a lot of like I don't remember the first movie I saw or the first TV show or whatever. But the first comic I read, because I found it was on my parents' bookshelf, there was a Calvin and Hobbes collection, and it happened to be the Essential Calvin and Hobbes, the first one. And I remember pulling it down off the shelf, opening it, and reading the first 4 panels, and like having to sort of parse what was going on. Like, oh, they're talking, and those are words. That's what they're saying. Figuring that out. But before that, I was drawing stuff. I would draw like these scenes. I call them like a battle scene, where it would be like a side view of like a hill and a castle, and like people attacking it. And I would draw these little stick figures attacking each other, and the stick figures defending it. And I made a whole bunch of these. And my art skills have not improved since.
Well, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you. Thank you.
This was so much fun.